Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Apiculture Online, Hive Chat with NC State. Really appreciate everybody joining us this evening. Those of us here in the NC State Apiculture Program, as well as those apiary inspectors from the North Carolina Department of Agriculture are here on our Zoom, and we welcome everybody on our YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining. The season's wrapping up, and so we have a nice hour in store for you. As always, we're going to start out by talking about the bees in season, and that is what your bees are doing right now and what you should be doing as a beekeeper in order to accommodate them. So one of the things to realize here, kind of getting into the very late fall, just heading into winter, is winter preparation. So getting your hives ready, that is preparing the boxes and the colony that resides within those boxes, is really, really critical for you, so that as the bees are going into winter, they're going to have an easier time throughout the winter. I won't go into that in detail right now, but if you're interested, go to our recorded webinar on our YouTube channel and see the last Apiculture Online. We covered that in depth last time. So a lot of really good information in there. What the colony is doing right now, right, is that they are really, really brooding down. So naturally, there's just this decline in the number of eggs that the queen is laying. As a result, the brood nest is kind of really shrinking as the older brood hatches out, and she's not kind of laying eggs to replace. And so they just keep going. Shrinking the brood nest, but then they start backfilling it with pollen and honey, so that they kind of fill all the combs up as best as they can. Really don't expect a whole lot more nectar flows unless you're actively supplementally feeding them, which again, John Harris is going to be talking about here coming up. There's not really a lot of late fall flow of nectar. And so the honey stores that they have is kind of what they're going into winter with. So unless you're going to give them a helping hand, and they're light, then they're going to need that helping hand. But hopefully what they have right now is a sufficient, 35 to 50 pounds of honey at least, depending on where you are in the state, to make it through the winter months. Now, the thing to remember about beekeeping and winter preparation, there's several old adages. There's tons of old adages in beekeeping, right? But some of them, when it goes into winter, some of them are really, really important to take home, in the sense that there's an old beekeeper adage that says, take your winter losses in the fall. And so what that really means is that it's a lot easier to overwinter one strong, well stocked colony that you can then split in the spring, rather than trying to nurse two weaker colonies through the winter, both of which will probably, not make it. And so uniting weaker colonies with stronger ones, rather than trying to nurse them along. That's what it means by taking your winter losses in the fall. You take two hives, you put them together into one, so you technically have lost one colony, but you're going to have much better overwintering success with that one colony. Another adage that you often hear is that bees don't freeze to death, they starve to death. And that's exactly right, because the bees, while they're kind of in a quiescent state, they're not active like they are during the busy period, the summer period. As long as they have honey stores, they can tap into those honey stores, generate heat, so that they can stay sufficiently warm in the cluster throughout the winter. So as long as they have food, they have the ability, at least the possibility, to generate heat, so they won't freeze. So you don't see bees freezing to death as long as they have honey, or at least oftentimes when they don't have honey. And then finally, the idea that these winter bees live longer, right? They live months rather than weeks, is really important. And that's why for the last several sessions, we've been talking about the reduction of the parasitism of varroa mites, so that they're not parasitizing those winter bees that have those fat stores and that can live much longer than the summer bees. And so hopefully that's already been done. Like we're past that now in the season. And so the winter bees that they've raised, they've pretty much raised them. And so hopefully they were not heavily parasitized by those varroa mites. Now it's important to remember what goes on in the winter cluster, of what's going on inside the colony. Again, you don't want to be going into your hive when it's cold outside. You just want to set them up for success and just let them go. You can check on them from the outside, but you never want to go and check on them in the inside and break all of those propolis seals and let the heat out and all that other stuff. So don't let curiosity get the better of you. Just put faith in the fact that if you put the cluster of bees and any residual remaining brood that they might have as you're batting down the hatches for winter, make sure that goes down on the bottom and that they're surrounded by, and importantly, have plenty of honey above them. All right. And that's because that cluster stays tight and they eat the honey in the comb as that cluster slowly moves through the comb throughout the winter, so that as they, kind of consume the honey down below, they then slowly move up. Because hot air rises, this honey is easier to uncap. And so coming out of winter, you often see a situation like this where the cluster is now above, eating the last residual honey in the box that was above the cluster going into winter. And that bottom box is now totally empty because they've consumed all the honey. Now, the dynamics of the cluster is pretty hard to study because, again, you can't kind of go in there. You don't want to break the dynamics of the cluster because it's very fragile. But in general, research has shown that the bees actually start to cluster at 64 degrees, which is still pretty warm as far as we're concerned. And they're certainly still flying, but it's cold for the bees. So they start to cluster so that they can retain heat and they don't lose as much heat when they cluster together. When the temperature drops even further and it gets to 50 degrees, that's when all foraging stops and everybody just goes into the cluster and you don't have flight activity. As it drops further and further down, that cluster gets tighter and tighter and tighter together as they continue to want to retain that body heat. And the cluster becomes densest because at maximum density at 14 degrees Fahrenheit ambient. Now, it's certainly not that inside the hive. The bees are able to retain the heat by clustering, but when it's that cold outside, that's when they get their maximum cluster density. And then if it gets even colder than that, that's when they start to generate heat. That's when they start to exercise their wing motor muscles to generate heat. It's kind of like us doing jumping jacks in place, right? Our muscles create that heat, and that heat is then radiated to the others in the cluster. And so what you tend to see is something like this. Now, this is not scientifically based. I completely made this up, so it very well could be wrong. It's more of a concept map. But this is the kind of, shall we say, the efficiency and the energy usage depending on the temperature, okay? So again, when it's 64 degrees and they're flying and actively foraging, they have brood, the bees are very active, they're using a lot of energy to raise brood and to fly and everything else. But as the temperature drops, especially below 50 degrees, they stop foraging, but they could still have some brood, so they still need to stay active in order to heat that brood and to keep that brood warm. When it drops for even below that, that's when they stop raising brood and they become much more quiescent and they get denser and denser in the cluster until they hit that 14 degrees where they're at their maximum density. All the while, they're saving energy because they're conserving energy rather than expending it. But as it gets colder and colder, that's when they have to start generating the heat, so they're using more energy than they would in the cluster. The point here is that they, in a really, really cold winter, they're using a lot of energy in the form of honey to generate heat. but it's markedly less than when it's actually slightly warm. It's above freezing, but below foraging temperature, where they actually go through more honey because they're more active, if that makes sense, right? So in some ways, a colder winter is better and they consume less honey per unit time when it's colder out because they're less metabolistically active than when it's slightly warmer and they can actually, start brooding up early or they're just more active. So this is why it can be really difficult to predict how much honey a colony needs going into winter, because you don't know how long or how cold the winter is going to be. But there's this idea that the warmer it is, the better it is for the bees, and so they don't need as much honey. Whereas actually the reverse is true. The warmer it is, the more active that they are, and they go faster through their honey stores. So it's just something to keep in mind, where you don't want to be going into your hives during the winter, but you can watch for flight activity, or you can knock on the side of the hive to hear the cluster buzzing inside. And then you can heft the back of the hive to see how much honey is stored in there. And if it's really, really light, then you know that you might have to step in and provide some supplemental feed, even in the middle of winter, kind of in a triage way. And again, we'll talk about that with John Harris. So, one of the things as beekeepers is we always want to be looking ahead, and we want to be looking 1 to 2 brood cycles ahead. That is 3 to 6 weeks from now. Well, right now it's really easy, right? Because 1 to 2 brood cycles from now, you shouldn't be doing anything in the bees. Hands off, don't be nosy, and don't let curiosity, get the better of you. On the warmer days, though, when it's above 50 to 55 degrees, you can check for flight activity. When it's warmer, the bees will want to go out and they will want to defecate and void themselves of, being cooped up for many days on end. But on colder days, again, just listen to make sure that the cluster is in there. And in fact, they even make infrared cameras where you can take a look at where the cluster is inside the hive, which is really, really fun. So the take-home message here is let the cluster do its thing, just set them up for success, and then just be vigilant and maintain the oversight of them. But you don't need to do anything hands-on to them because they're best left on their own. So with that, I'm going to invite John Harris. Now, for many of you may not know John, but he's the most recent hire of the excellent NC Department of Agriculture apiary inspection team. You're based out of, is it Johnson County, John?
I'm in the southeastern part of the state, David.
The total southeastern. So you go all the way from Brunswick up. How far east or west do you go?
Basically, Bladen County, and then up Sampson County, all the way out to Moorhead, and then south to the South Carolina border.
Okay, great. Well, he brings with him a lot of beekeeping experience. He's been in the industry for a long time, and he suggested this timely topic about feeding bees for and through the winter. And there's a lot of differences here. And especially the fact that, John is down in the Southeast where they barely have much of a winter as far as, others are concerned. And I would say that bees down your way never really go broodless. Is that correct?
Most of the time they have quite a bit of brood. It's going to depend on the winter. We haven't had a winter in the last 3 years. So there you go, back to your point about how much food they're going to eat over winter.
Right. But contrast that with, folks up in the mountains or further up north, right? They have longer winters, earlier winters, late, the spring starts later. And so you kind of need to gauge that depending on where you are, right? We've also had very mild winters the last few here in the Piedmont where Raleigh is at. We haven't seen a shot like this in quite some time. But again, you can't predict this, but you need to be prepared for it and think about it kind of at the long-term scale. I only bring that up is because anything that we say here, you need to remember that where you are will dictate how much or how little of these different things that you might need to do. Okay, so just realize that there's no one size fits all when it comes to, feeding for and through the winter. Now, when it comes to supplemental feeding, you pretty much break it down into two macronutrients, right? You got your carbohydrates and you got your protein. Now, most of the time, the bees really need carbohydrates. We'll touch a little bit on the protein here at the end, but most of the time, because they need carbohydrates in the form of honey naturally in order to generate heat and to stay viable throughout the winter, if you need to supplementally feed them for and through the winter, it's mostly going to be carbohydrates. So, John, why don't you walk us through some of these different approaches or these different formulations of sugar that beekeepers often provide their hives?
Well, basically right now, the easiest thing is we want to get weight on the bees if they're light going in right now. So if, syrup's going to be the easiest thing to get that in there where they can actually put it in a cone and then right now your ratio is the 2-to-1, and that's the heavier syrup. So that helps the bees gain that weight with the minimum of moisture. And once the weather starts cooling down, you don't want to add a lot of moisture in that hive because of condensation issues. So you want to stick with that heavier syrup now. Or about a month ago, if you were trying to get that last cycle of bees, and I still have a few people in my area trying to get that last cycle of winter bees, and they're feeding a 1.5 or a lighter syrup to stimulate the bees, try to get one more brood cycle of winter bees. So, but the important thing is using that thicker syrup. And some people are using the essential oils in there, and it's just very, very little essential oils. That's usually just to retard fermentation. Sometimes some people are using something like Honeybee Healthy or one of the other products.
And that's not really necessary,
No,
this time of year either, because
it's easy. That's if you use the lighter syrups like you do in the spring,
right,
they're more prone to that fermentation.
Exactly. Now tell us a little bit about the fondant, knowing that there's some real caveats here about making it up.
Well, the thing about it is, I hate to say this, you can go to the bee supplies and some other sources and actually buy fondant pre-made. If you're making your own, you'll see, if you go online, you can see that it is a process, and you're working with something that's very hot. It's you're boiling sugar and you have to use a candy thermometer because you're actually making candy. And with that said, you've got to be super, super careful. I mean, nobody wants to, I hear enough beekeeper accidents. We don't need anybody in the hospital with third-degree burns.
Yeah, it's like magma.
But there is, if you go in the catalogs and the bee supplies, you will see commercial fondant available, which is ready to use. You either cut it off or it's already pre-cut. So that's where we are on the fondant. But it is moisture, so it's easier for the bees to work that fondant that will be like dried sugar.
So of that dry sugar, so they have these sugar bricks or these sugar cakes that that's kind of increasingly popular now, and that's what these pictures are here on the side. How do you make those up or purchase those, and how do you apply them to the colonies during the cluster?
The sugar bricks, the good thing about them, you're using a cold process, and basically you're just adding enough water where you make the sugar sticky, where you can press it into like a candy board, and you can make your own candy boards. And basically the candy board is just basically, it's an extended piece that fits the same size as the box. And some of them have hardware cloth in the bottom. Some of them have like a plywood bottom with a hole drilled in it on the commercial side. But basically you put a little bit of vinegar and mix it into the water, and then you just stir that water into that sugar mix. And basically you pack it into your, whatever, the pan or whatever how you're gonna do it. The picture here shows an easy way you just do it in the pan and you let it dry out overnight until it's hard. And you can put it directly on top of the frames instead of empty box or empty, something to cover that, but you don't want frames over it, just put empty box. And that way the bees, as they can go up there and they'll get their own moisture and they'll eat that sugar instead of starving to death. And it's basically a very good way to back up. So if they run out of honey down below, they've got some emergency stores there. And some people had asked you in one of the previous seminars that about the quilt, what they call the quilt boxes, and it's the same process. You're putting the sugar brick in that, and some people are adding, wood shavings or whatever for insulation to absorb the moisture, but they've got that sugar brick in the bottom of that where the bees can go up there and access food. And it's a very good emergency or a backup where the bees won't starve to death. And
so that's an important point, right? Like the ideal is you gave them plenty of honey going into winter, so you don't need to do any of this, right?
And it's really good if you're in the colder, if you're upstate, what I call upstate towards the mountains, upper Piedmont, where it actually gets going to be cooler, and there's a lot of people in my area use these things very successfully.
Yeah.
So it's a good product, and it's a good thing to think about. And it's an easy thing that if you miss a week or two, because a lot of times if it's warm enough, you can lift the cover up. You don't want to disturb that cluster, even if they're in a loose cluster. Yeah. But we have so many warm days, you can lift it up and actually take a peek. And if they run out of food, and you can sort of do the hive lift. And that's an experience thing that people just sort of need to learn, that you just put your hand in the hole and sort of lift up on the box gently to see, if it's real light, you take one finger and you lift the whole box up, that they're out of food.
Yeah, I referred to that earlier as hefting. You heft it up.
That's it.
Yep.
And if you lift the cover up on a warm day and all the bees are up under the cover, and I'm not talking about the guard bees up there normally up there, I'm talking about all the bees at their very top, they've eaten everything down below. And going back to your point, it's really important to be a weather watcher. And if we have one of these warm winters, they can go through a super honey, no problem. And then, they won't even make it in January. And you got to think about it. They've got to get all the way into March to that, maple flow in February and March. And that's a long time to go if you run out of food. And there's nothing worse than having healthy bees going into winter. And then you go in there and you see them tail up in the empty comb where they've starved to death.
Yeah. So this is these are emergency things. Hopefully you set them up for success and it all goes right, but you don't have control over it. So this is something.
And David, let me mention one thing on the syrup.
Yeah.
There's lots of feeders out there. And the important thing about it is if you're losing liquid syrup to feed your bees, especially in the winter, you don't want a feeder that's going to drip on them, once it turns cold. Some people will have these little jar feeders that are sitting right over the top, and there's nothing wrong with those. But once it gets cold and that thing's sitting up there and it gets warm in the sun and it starts dripping and it's cold outside, that cold syrup is not going to be good for the bees.
And they don't break cluster. If it's too cold, they won't break cluster to go up there and get it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, we were saying before that the best thing is honey in the comb for them to eat. Well, we put a point in here just to make it very clear that, if honey is the best thing for them to eat, then I'm going to go down to Costco and I'm going to get that, 5-gallon drum of honey, and I'm going to feed that to the bees, and that's going to be better. But that's not exactly correct, is it?
Well, there's a lot of studies out there, about the sugar in the honey. But the thing about it is with the honey, if it's your own honey that your bees and their bees are healthy, you don't have American foul brood, you can feed your own honey. If you have surplus you stuck in the freezer or whatever. But thing is, you go out and buy honey in the grocery store or out on the market, you don't know if it came from a healthy hive. It has American foul brood spores in it. You've just contaminated your bees, and nobody wants to get American foul brood if they don't have to.
That's correct.
So, you can have disease issues with honey. So that's the reason you want to use it from healthy hives. And to tie it up, David, we're talking about sugar. We're talking about sucrose, granulated sugar.
Yep.
And we're not talking about, and it seems to be a lot better than the corn syrup. Yep. So all this stuff that we're talking about here is all just, the granulated sugar.
Yeah, there's a lot of other formulations of sugar out there, and they're come pre-liquidified and all this other stuff. We're not getting into this. This is, mostly for kind of backyard, easy recipes for beekeepers to follow.
Exactly.
So before we, go to Kasie Raymann, let's talk a little bit about the other macronutrient that we said, which is protein, right, in the form of these pollen patties. A recipe that we found is really good, is 1 part of granulated sugar, again the normal sucrose sugar, to 1 part of your own collected pollen. Again, don't trust somebody else's pollen. Trap the pollen in the spring, throw it in the freezer, and then use it to make your own pollen patties later on. And then you just take a heavy syrup and kind of drizzle it in and make it combine like cookie dough, and then put it in between 2 wax sheets, and you got these homemade, ready-made pollen patties that you can add. But is this the correct time that you want to be adding these pollen patties, John?
Not for most people. Right now their bees bring in tremendous amount of natural pollen. And as long as it's warm, most of these in eastern North Carolina and in through the Piedmont will bring in their own pollen.
Yep.
And you don't need to push that protein unless you're trying to actually build them up, like the guys going to California in January. And most of our people are not doing that. So, this is something you want to do when there's a dearth of pollen. So like in January, before the maple blooms, sometimes in that period of time, it'll be warm enough for bees to fly, but there's just not a lot of pollen out there in nature. So it's a good way to get the bees boosted early with protein, so they can build up for that spring flow, so you can actually make some honey or do splits.
Exactly right. They will start brooding up kind of in mid to late winter to be ready for the spring, and so that can help boost them a little bit. We tend to do that in early to mid January around where we are now. This homemade pollen patty recipe provided here is one that can easily be made pretty much by anybody who has the forethought to trap their own pollen. But you can buy these things too, again, through a lot of the beekeeping supply companies. And you see a lot of them labeled with probiotics. And so what do you think of those, or is it kind of too early to tell?
David, I'm hearing a lot of people having good luck with it. I haven't seen the science, and I know it's a very new thing. And I guess it's sort of like us. If you have health issues or whatever, that the prebiotics are not going to be a negative per se, but how much they help, I can't tell you. Yeah. It's just one of those things. I know people are using them and swearing by them, but I'd like to see some more studies on it, to be honest with you. But it's but some of the pollen, the commercial pollen patties, and these are more of on what's on the commercial stuff. They have actually improved these things a lot, and I've seen some excellent results using them. A lot of the commercial people use them, yeah, and have very good results.
Right.
The only thing is, if you're in, especially like in my area, and Mr. Hopkins he's probably squirming because he knows I'm going to say something about hive beetles. But if you use these pollen patties, you got to really be careful and have control of the hive beetles, or you'd be raising hive beetles, because they love to get up under those, and they thrive on protein, and it's not a good thing. So you got to be really careful about using them.
Exactly right. It's the perfect food. It's the ideal diet actually for the small hive beetles. So yeah, definitely beware, especially in the active season, warmer months. Well, I brought that up about the probiotics, and thanks so much, John. I haven't seen if there's any questions here, but hopefully we have a bunch of questions that we can get to later in the Q&A. But I brought up the probiotics in these commercial protein products that you see out there, because probiotics really means bacteria, healthy bacteria that's supposed to help digestion. And that's a good way to introduce a new microbiologist, honeybee microbiologist here in the state of North Carolina, Dr. Kasie Raymann, who started 2-3 years ago at UNC Greensboro. And she brings with her a real expertise and a lot of excellent research on microbiology, both pathogenic and beneficial microbes, as well as the gut microbiome and just the beneficial bacteria that live inside of honeybees as well. And so I want to welcome Kasie, and welcome to Apiculture Online.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, David, and all the hosts for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, I think all of this has really segued very perfectly into what I'm doing. So.
Well, I did that on purpose, not to put you on the spot at all, but any beekeeper that asks me a question about is this probiotic a good thing or a bad thing, I go to you. Because you have an infinitely better idea than I do. And my understanding is that not only are some of these probiotics not really tested or kind of proven, even though, as John said, there may be some anecdotal, benefit to them, but some of these probiotics don't even naturally exist in the honeybee in the first place. Is that right?
That's completely true. And like you said, to my knowledge anyways, the ones that are marketed to beekeepers, specifically if you go to any beekeeping website to buy a probiotic for your bees, they do not contain any microbes that actually exist within the honeybee microbiome. And in fact, if you look at the ingredients, most of them are microbes isolated either from the human microbiome, cattle, poultry. So there's a lot of these companies that had been making probiotics for agricultural industry.
Right.
And so they just basically use the same formula and decided to market it towards honeybees. The problem with this is that, things like Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is baker's yeast, that's a component in some of those probiotics. We know that microbe never colonizes honeybee guts. We, from my research and many others, and mostly pioneered in Nancy Moran's lab at UT Austin, we know that the honeybee microbiome is really specific, and there are 5 species or core microbes that live there, and none of these probiotics contain any of those species. So
then I guess there's 2 questions then when it comes to that. The fact that they're not quote unquote honeybee microbes, does that make them bad? I'm assuming none of them are pathogenic, but does that make them bad, neutral, or potentially beneficial, right? And then the second is, do the microbes that do naturally colonize the guts of honeybees, can they live outside the guts of honeybees, be cultured, and then added to said products?
Okay. So first, to address the question about whether they could be bad.
Right.
So we don't know, really.
Okay.
I mean, you really never know when you're introducing a foreign species into an environment where it doesn't normally exist, if it's going to have a bad interaction or not. My intuition is really that they're just not going to colonize, because, microbes that colonize the guts of organisms, like even humans or other animals, they're very specific. They've evolved to be able to colonize our intestines and to provide us with very essential things. And so what I'm assuming, without knowing the research, but we can get to that a little bit later, so it's something I'm working on, is that they're just not going to colonize at all. So you're basically just throwing a bunch of microbes at them that nothing's going to happen. So potentially not harmful, but we can't say that it isn't harmful at all, because how do we know that some of those microbes might not be able to colonize and cause harm? Right. So the verdict's still kind of out there on that, I would say.
Okay.
And then in terms of making and culturing a real probiotic, that is something that, yes, I've worked on a little bit. I know that Nancy Moran's lab at UT Austin's working on, and I worked on that a bit as a postdoc. We have a lot of evidence, and there's even been some evidence, I think, from Kirk Anderson's lab, using strains that are directly isolated from the honeybee gut microbiome and using them as probiotics, and they seem to be working extremely well.
Oh, great.
And so one thing that we've been able to do is make these sort of artificial communities, but they're all isolated from honeybees.
Right.
But show that after we treat them with antibiotics and they get their gut microbiome wiped out, we can restore the microbiome using a natural probiotic. The problem with the commercial ones is that they don't contain the natural microbes. And the problem with the ones we're using is that, we're scientists. And so we have them in the lab, we know how to culture them. It's really complicated, but it hasn't been commercialized yet. It hasn't become a patent. And so I think we're moving in that direction, and I'm really excited about it. And I do believe in probiotics in that sense. Just like that's how I feel about human probiotics too, because a lot of the things that we think are helping us aren't really doing anything either. It's a big, sort of marketing scam. And that's sort of, I think, what's going on with honeybees as well. But I do think there's a lot of promise in it. And I think we're moving towards that.
Well, I think that just underscores the need for scientists like yourself and the folks in your lab, and the great potential that this has, right? Because there's in the last 10, 20 years, it's just been this huge eye-opening as just how important, gut microbes are for overall health. And we all know that honeybee health has a lot of challenges. So this could really hold a key and a lot of promise. So, so keep that up. In addition to, that work, what are some of the other things that you have going on at UNC Greensboro and research in your lab?
So I would say one of our major projects that we're working on is a federally funded project to really try to understand what are the things that shape the microbiome within honeybees. So we know a lot about the honeybee microbiome in terms of what microbes are there. In general, most honeybees have the same species present. But what's been a really shocking revelation in honeybee microbiome research is that each honeybee has several different strains. So those are variants of different species that are present that have different gene contents that can provide different functions for the honeybee. So for example, you could have a honeybee within your hive that has a strain of a microbiome that can make it be able to digest toxic sugars like mannose. You could have another bee that doesn't have that strain. You can have a honeybee within the same colony that has the ability to withstand glyphosate or metaclopride exposure, and then the same honeybee sister within the hive doesn't. And so we have this really extreme variation in functional ability within the gut microbiome. And so one of the biggest projects in my lab is to really understand what's shaping that composition. So is it because we have so much genetic diversity within one colony because the queen mates with so many different drones that all of the sisters are distantly related, and that kind of can change the ability of microbes to inhabit? Is it change in age and diet that causes the changes in the microbiome? Or is it really just like microbial dynamics where whatever microbe colonizes first, that really determines what microbes are going to be in the gut of a bee? And so by understanding that, we can really try to unravel what structures a honeybee microbiome and what are the best functions that are available for a honeybee microbiome. And then maybe in the future, be able to, make these communities or engineer these communities to be more beneficial to bees.
So just to be clear, you're looking at just the natural variation that's already there. You're not manipulating it or, kind of genetically engineering anything. You're just trying to understand those dynamics. Because once you understand those dynamics, then you know what is healthy, what is good, and what is not. And, as you pointed out, in honeybees, diversity tends to be not necessarily better, it's more stabilizing, right? And so the same thing, seems that it could very well apply. That is it better for all bees to have the same community, or is it better to have different bees have different communities?
Exactly.
And we don't really know that. That's really, really cool. Another real kind of big thing that's happened within the last year or so at UNC Greensboro is that you guys have opened a new plant and pollination health center. I think I'm butchering the name. What was the
Plant and Pollinator Center.
Plant and Pollinator Center. Yeah. So it's not there on the main campus in Greensboro. It's a bit north on a satellite campus. So tell us a little more about what's going on there and who else is taking part in that facility?
So the Plant and Pollinator Center was an initiative funded by our previous provost. We actually just got a new provost at UNCG, which is very in support of the Plant and Pollinator Center as well. But our previous provost saw a great need to invest a lot of funding into plant and pollinator sciences, especially with we had Olav Ruppel in the department. I joined the department, and we have a pretty strong plant diversity and plant ecology group of faculty at UNCG. So the idea for the center was really to strengthen our areas and plant and pollinators and try to intersect the two studies, because we know that these two things play on each other.
Sure.
Pollinators need plants and plants need pollinators. And so trying to kind of create a collaborative atmosphere for new faculty and existing faculty, and create a center where we can do field work, where we can have all of our hives, and where we can do community outreach events and things like that. So it just opened about a year ago, and we're moving forward with that. I think we've gotten things pretty established up there, but we have a lot of vision for the center. A lot of the events that we planned there with beekeepers and master gardeners, unfortunately, were canceled this year because of COVID.
Sure. Yep.
But we definitely plan to make this sort of a hub where we can share research and invite scientists from the region, and invite beekeepers from the region, as well as gardeners and things like that, to do a lot of events and outreach. And
well, that's really great, and great to hear. In so many other states, they're building multi-million-dollar, bee labs. There's a lot of coordination between honeybee research and native bee, or these solitary bees. And so a lot of these kind of new bee labs are taking in that type of collaboration and that type of approach. But I think yours is one where it's different, where it's teaming up with folks from the plant side rather than other types of bees. And so it really kind of sets you apart in a lot of ways. And I think that that's a nice way to phase shift away from some of these others. And we all know that that's needed as well. Yeah. So anything else that's going on? Are you hunting for new graduate students, or what's on the horizon? What's on your wish list?
I'm always open for grad student applications. I haven't been actively advertising, because I have 4 graduate students right now, but
it's a lot.
Definitely open for any applications of people interested in microbiology, honeybee research, things like that. On the horizon, I mean, I don't know, just trying to get back to work with the COVID stuff, trying to get our bees through the winter, which, is all, as we all know, a big challenge. It really impacts our research program when we lose a lot of hives over winter. So we devote a lot of time right now to, really try and take care of them. But on the other hand, we do keep our bees completely organically. So it makes it even more challenging, because we don't want to treat our bees and have it interfere with, our research that we're doing and things like that. So right. Definitely a big challenge for us right now, and something we're focusing on.
Yeah, big challenge for everybody, but especially kind of running these types of programs. So totally understand. Well, I think we're going to segue now into the kind of question and answer session. We got tons of questions flying in on the YouTube channel, and so I'll try to select those that are most germane to you, Kasie, and ask them of you. One here is that what's the potential to bioengineer the honeybee gut microbiome to provide new advantages to the bees, such as, and I think you mentioned this, that some of the microbes can be good at detoxifying environmental toxins like pesticides?
Well, this is a really timely question, because a graduate student in Nancy Moran's lab, Sean Leonard, just published a paper in Science where he was able to engineer the gut microbiome members to be able to prevent infection by viruses transmitted by varroa mites.
Mhm.
This is a really huge thing, and he's devoted several years working on this. But in their lab, they've also worked on getting the gut microbes to overexpress dopamine to change the behavior of bees and all kinds of things. So there's a huge potential in the area of being able to engineer the microbes for different things. I think with engineering, and we have to think about this when we engineer anything, there's always ethical concerns.
Yep.
There's always concerns about the engineered microbes getting out into the environment. There's concerns about the engineered microbes evolving into, something that does something we don't want. So this is a really new field, but it's definitely promising. And I would say that it's something that's being worked on for sure, just not something that I think is going to be released in practice in beekeeping anytime soon.
Yeah. And also to make the distinction between engineering the microbes that live in the bees and perform functions versus engineering the bees themselves, right? Which is, I think, yet even another kind of ethical question and dilemma. There was another question here that came in privately to me. Are you doing any research on pathogens of bees?
I would say yes. I don't know if other beekeepers would say yes. So the pathogen I focus on is Serratia marcescens, which is an opportunistic pathogen of honeybees. So
that's something that's being mentioned in some of the beekeeping periodicals and stuff, but it's relatively new and mysterious. So enlighten us if you could.
So this is an enterobacter, so similar to E. coli. And Serratia marcescens is actually a pathogen of basically everything. It's an opportunistic pathogen of humans. It's an opportunistic pathogen of plants and like every animal, basically. And so when I started my postdoc, I noticed that sometimes in the gut microbiome of honeybees, we would see a really small abundance of Serratia marcescens. And I just was like, had been a few old papers suggesting it could be a pathogen, but nothing really proven. And so I really went like full force into this because I love opportunistic pathogens. They're super cool and their evolution is really cool. So I isolated several of them from the honeybee microbiome, and I've done a lot of work showing that they are pretty virulent to honeybees, but really in an opportunistic manner, right? So if you treat your hive with antibiotics, these microbes that are present in really small abundance, usually in the hive and in the microbiome, can then overtake, sort of like, I'm not sure if you're all familiar with like C. diff in the human microbiome, which is a pathogen we know when we take antibiotics can overtake and cause disease. So Serratia marcescens is really similar to that in honeybees in the sense that if they're immunocompromised or if their microbiome is disrupted, this bacteria can become a huge problem.
Right.
And so I'm really interested. I've studied sort of the prevalence of it across hives in the US. It seems to be very prevalent, and that it only becomes a problem, like I said, when it reaches high abundance under certain circumstances. And now I'm really trying to understand when it becomes virulent, why it becomes virulent, and how does the microbiome protect against it? We've also done some work with the natural probiotics we made and showed that after we give antibiotics to honeybees, we can give them this probiotic, the natural one from their gut microbes, and then suscept them to Serratia. And if we give them the probiotic, they don't actually succumb to infection by Serratia.
Right.
So this is really promising that The microbiome is playing a huge role in protection there. So this is sort of just like a under the scenes pathogen that I would say the everyday beekeeper doesn't need to worry about a lot unless they're treating with antibiotics frequently.
Right.
But something that definitely can arise as an issue. And
well, they always start small and under the radar until they're a problem, right? I won't elaborate.
Well, I was going to say that Dr. Tarpey and I have also done a little bit of, brainstorming about working on EFB, which we haven't done much on, but that's also a potential area that we might pursue in the future.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that is something that is more of a management problem right now for most beekeepers. So let's open it up a little bit more to some other questions and bring John back into the conversation here. And just a reminder about what's the ratio of sugar to water if you want to feed right now?
Right now, you should be probably going into the heavier syrup, and that's a 2-part sugar to 1 part water. And it's just equal volume. And, and people don't have to worry about it being exact to the grain of sugar. I mean, if you're close, it works.
Yep.
So they don't need to over worry about it, but basically you're looking at 2-part sugar to 1 part water.
As thick as you can make it. That's in essence.
That's it.
Yeah.
And because you're really wanting, if you're light on carbohydrates, you want them to stuff it in the cells so they've got something to live on, because they have to have those carbohydrates to keep that little bit of brood. They keep going. They need to have it to keep themselves warm. And if we have a warm winter, they're out there flying around burning up calories, and they got to have it to keep going. So going back to your weather issue.
Yeah, exactly. There's some other questions here in the chat, and then others have been answering them, which I absolutely love, that kind of community feedback. So I won't go into those, but those are all great about trapping. That's something maybe we can talk about next year, about how to trap your own pollen so that you can save it for later on. But here's another question, and John, again, feel free to take this one. What happens if a colony does fail through the winter? Again, you could do everything right as a beekeeper and still the bees won't make it through the winter. But what do you do with those dead outs? What do you do with that, the comb and the hive during the winter?
Well, there's 2 parts to that. If it's disease free and it was just either they had a mite issue that the virus, they got their, let's say, for example, they got their mite treatments on late, and the viruses are always going to be behind the mites. Yeah. So in other words, the mites are vectoring the viruses. Well, once you get rid of the mites, it takes a while to get rid of the viruses. Yeah. So with that said, if those bees were weak going into winter and had bees with, not heavy, have fat bodies, and they end up losing them, and it's healthy, didn't have any brood diseases or issues, you can either put those combs out, freeze them, put moth crystals on them. And if it did have an issue that they were worried about, thought it might be a foul brood issue or something, they could talk to their apiary inspector, and they could there's a thing that they can go, and we can put it in the compression chamber and sterilize it.
Right. So let's see, there's some other things here. There's another question about wrapping and insulating your hives. I, again, use that caveat as where it depends on where you are, but pretty much down here in the Southeast, even if you're kind of up north in the mountains, high elevation, as long as the bees have honey, there's really no need. The only times when I really see wrapping as being necessary is like in Minnesota and Canada, and like really, really long, prolonged and harsh winters. Would you agree with that, John? Even though you, as you say, you haven't had winter in the last 3 years down your way.
Yeah, and you got to remember, when you brought up the infrared, the bees they have that cluster, and the cluster keeps the cluster warm. They're not warming the box. I mean, you do get that excess heat that comes off the cluster that may rise above, but the bees are keeping themselves warm. They're not warming the box. Right. And people get carried away with that, but yeah, if you're in upstate New York, or North Dakota, guess what? You're in the low teens or zeros. Yeah, and you don't want air blowing through there. The only thing is, if you've got screen bottoms or something, you might want to close those in the wintertime where you don't have wind blowing in there. And of course, the bees are collecting propolis right now, so they're sealing up the cracks.
Yep.
So as long as there's not wind blowing through, cooling them down, and I would recommend putting wind breaks up if you're in a windy area. And there's different ways you can do that. So
yeah. So that's good advice as far as to wrap or not to wrap, and I would probably err on the side of not wrapping, at least kind of in the southeast. Here's another question. This is one for Kasie or John or anybody else on the call who would like to answer, as far as concerning that foul brood, and especially American foul brood. Well, it just says, the question says foul brood. We were talking about European foul brood. But the question was, they've never had it, but they were told to burn everything. Is that good or bad advice? Who'd like to take that,
David? Basically, American foul brood is the one that you would either sterilize, in the chamber, or you would burn the frames.
Yep.
And that's the one you burn, because those spores, they live forever. They'll outlive us twice.
That's right.
The studies are unbelievable when you start looking at American foul brood.
What's the record, Kasie, of an American foul brood spore and how old it is of infecting a honeybee larva?
Oh, you mean how long have spores been detected
Yes.
in the hive?
How long have spores been viable? I remember hearing an anecdotal report of a 80-year-old equipment being reused, and the bees still getting American foul.
Yeah, I think that the stat I know is 50 years, but I'm sure it's longer, because from what I know about microbes, which hopefully is quite a bit since I'm a microbiologist, spores can live for a really long time. And so, that's really why, the idea is either completely destroying everything or continuously treating with antibiotics so that you keep the spores dormant. And that's really the two options you have there.
And is that latter one really a good one?
I would say no, but I had a really strong opinion about this, actually, and then I went to some conferences with people that work with commercial beekeepers, and I really got a different perspective there. When you have a big commercial operation and you have hundreds and hundreds of hives, you can't really afford to burn all of your hives, right? And that's your livelihood, and it's also the livelihood of our agricultural system. So right now, it in some cases is the only option we have, even though I'm a strong in strong opposition of antibiotics for many, many reasons, which we didn't get into here. I do think that, we don't have another option in some cases right now.
Now, I just want to make this perfectly clear. What both you and John have been talking about here is American foul brood, which forms these spores that are long-lived and incredibly infectious. Is the same true that if you have European foul brood, do you need to burn all of your hives?
No.
That's because it doesn't go into the spore forming phase. It's not nearly as infectious, right? So if American foul brood was a 10, where does European foul brood rank on that on a scale of 1 to 10?
1.
So it's much benign. So yeah, you don't need to burn your hive. I just want to make sure that, but this is why it's also really important to get up with these folks at the NCDA and your apiary inspectors and learn how to distinguish those American foul broods as well as other brood diseases, so that, you don't burn your equipment when you don't have to, or even worse, that you misdiagnose American foul brood as something else and it spreads like wildfire to you and everybody else. So just make sure that that's the case.
David, again, we do have that fumigation chamber.
Yep.
That they can get, and it's a minimal fee.
Nominal fee
per box. So it's a lot cheaper than buying new boxes of frames.
You bet.
I was just going to mention well, just yesterday we were talking to EPA about that
Yeah,
and maintaining the registration for the ethylene oxide chamber.
great.
That was demonstrated back in the 70s
Yeah.
to effectively kill the spores. It was done by the folks up in Beltsville at the time.
So what's great about that is that that's really unique, right? Or is there one other state that has it? Or I think
The
it's
only one
unique to North
currently
Carolina.
has
Yeah.
a special local need for that.
Yeah. So definitely get up with your apiary inspectors. They will drive that equipment and handle that for you and fumigate it. And it's a really, really excellent service. So that's another alternative that's very unique to us. Well, I want to thank everybody who's joined in and spoken today, especially Dr. Kasie Raymann. I want to thank her and all her expertise and wish her nothing but success as you continue doing your excellent progress over there in UNC Greensboro. I want to remind everybody that we do these apiculture onlines every other week. So our next and actual final for the season, Apiculture Online, is going to be November 4th. We're going to be talking about honeybee pheromones because our interview guest is going to be Dr. Mark Carroll, who's a research scientist in the USDA out in Tucson, Arizona. So he's actually one of the world's experts on honeybee pheromones, as is our very own Dr. Brad Metz, who's a postdoc and research associate in our program. And so we're going to have a really great conversation about pheromones with Mark as our guest of honor. So be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave comments, and upvote and to like us. And hopefully we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks again, everybody.